London has long been a city of industry and commerce that has attracted people from numerous countries to settle and call it home. Long ago it was the Romans that came and established the original settlement, and hundreds of years later, French Huguenots and Jewish people came and thrived in trades, such as silk weaving in the city's East End. So too, Irish people, for Ireland being so close to the British Isles has meant there has long been continuous movement of people between islands. In fact, it is estimated that as many as 6 million people in the UK have at least one Irish grandparent. The most significant event to drive immigration to England was the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s. Following a series of potato crop failures, more than 1 million people died and a similar number emigrated to escape poverty and starvation. Irish people settled throughout Great Britain, and today the greatest number live in London, with the term London Irish referring to people born in London of Irish descent. From the 20th century to recent times, well-known Irish communities in North and West London include Kilburn, Cricklewood, Archway, Camden Town, Shepherd's Bush and Greenford. Today, however, we travel back to London of the late 1840s and to the city's Rosemary Lane to hear an eyewitness account of life for the capital's Irish immigrants in the homes and streets of the East End. Henry Mayhew, a journalist, observed and documented the lives of everyday people in Victorian London, interviewing the working class and making a record of his conversations. He describes, with first-hand accounts, how hard life really was for the capital's poor, and in this account you will hear his description of the Irish community and an interview with some of its residents. Mayhew's words sometimes seem to stereotype and lack empathy. Taking into account his descriptions are over 150 years old. That perhaps reflects the time in which he writes, and whilst an investigative journalist, he seems to reflect on, or be influenced by, the views of people he met and interviewed, rather than solely his own observations. Whilst slums inhabited by the English were known as rookeries, at this time, after the bird that nests in large colonies crammed into noisy treetops, here he refers to the streets as nests, repeating what he has heard them called. He offers no further explanation. He may have been influenced by the prejudices of others in relation to the Irish community, but this is mere speculation. It is noteworthy that for all his descriptions of Rosemary Lane as a listless place with people of, according to his words, lazy appearance, he does give some balance by acknowledging how supportive the Irish are of each other, and goes on to assert that they will undertake the severest bodily labour which the English are unfitted for. A statement at odds with his earlier comments and acknowledging that the community is hard-working. This is not a world we can return to, though I think history is worth questioning. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Rosemary Lane was a well-known rag fair for the sale of second-hand clothes and a reputation for dirt and disorder. Here, the streets were a rabbit warren of dark alleys and hidden courts flanked by lofty and decaying wooden houses into which crowded peddlers, costermongers and labourers, often more than one family to a room. This is the scene into which we accompany Mayhew. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. In almost all of the poorer districts of London are to be found nests of Irish, as they are called, or courts inhabited solely by the Irish costermongers. These people form separate colonies, rarely visiting or mingling with the English costers. It is curious, on walking through one of these settlements, to notice the manner in which the Irish deal among themselves, street seller buying of street seller. Even in some of the smallest courts, there may be seen stalls of vegetables, dried herrings or salt cod, thriving on the associative principle by mutual support. The parts of London that are the most thickly populated with Irish lie about Brook Street, Ratcliffe Cross, down both sides of the Commercial Road and in Rosemary Lane, though nearly all the Coster districts have their Irish settlements. Cromer Street, Saffron Hill and King Street, Drury Lane, for instance, being thickly populated with the Irish, but the places I have mentioned above are peculiarly distinguished by being almost entirely peopled by visitors from the sister isle. The same system of immigration is pursued in London as in America. As soon as the first settler is thriving in his newly chosen country, a certain portion of his or her earnings are carefully hoarded up, until they are sufficient to pay for the removal of another member of the family to England. Then one of the friends left at home is sent for, and thus by degrees the entire family is got over, and once more united. Perhaps there is no quarter of London where the habits and habitations of the Irish can be better seen and studied than in Rosemary Lane, and the little courts and alleys that spring from it on each side. Some of these courts have other courts branching off from them, so that the locality is a perfect labyrinth of blind alleys, and when once in the heart of the maze it is difficult to find the path that leads to the main road. As you walk down the lane and peep through the narrow openings between the houses, the place seems like a huge peep show, with dark holes of gateways to look through, while the court within appears bright with the daylight, and down it are seen rough-headed urchins running with their feet bare through the puddles, and bonnetless girls, huddled in shawls, lolling against the door-posts. Sometimes you see a long narrow alley, with the houses so close together that opposite neighbours are talking from their windows, while the ropes, stretched zigzag from wall to wall, afford just room enough to dry a blanket or a couple of shirts that swell out dropsically in the wind. I visited one of the paved yards round which the Irish live, and found that it had been turned into a complete drying ground, with shirts, gowns, and petticoats of every description and colour. The buildings at the end were completely hidden by the things, and the air felt damp and chilly, and smelt of soap suds. The gutter was filled with dirty grey water, emptied from the wash-tubs, and on the top were the thick bubbles floating about under the breath of the boys playing at boats with them. It is the custom of the inhabitants of these courts and alleys to assemble at the entrance with their baskets and chat and smoke away the morning. Every court entrance has its little group of girls and women, lolling listlessly against the sides, with their heads uncovered, and their luxuriant hair fuzzy as oakum, tarred fibre. It is peculiar with the Irish women that, after having been accustomed to their hoods, they seldom wear bonnets, unless on a long journey. Nearly all of them, too, have a thick plaid shawl, which they keep on all the day through, with their hands covered under it. At the mouth of the only thoroughfare deserving of the name of street, for a cart could just go through it, were congregated about 30 men and women, who rented rooms in the houses on each side of the road. 6 women, with baskets of dried herrings, were crouching in a line on the curbstone, with the fish before them. Their legs were drawn up so closely to their bodies that the shawl covered the entire figure, and they looked very like the podgy tombolas sold by the Italian boys. As all their wares were alike, it was puzzling work to imagine how, without the strongest opposition, they could each obtain a living. The men were dressed in long tailcoats, with 1 or 2 brass buttons. One old dame, with a face wrinkled like a dried plum, had her cloak placed over her head like a hood, and the grizzly hair hung down in matted hanks about her face, her black eyes shining between the locks like those of a skye terrier. Beside her was another old woman, smoking a pipe so short that her nose reached over the bowl. After looking at some of the group, it was pleasant to gaze upon the pretty faces of the 1 or 2 girls that lolled against the wall. Their black hair, smoothed with grease, and shining almost as if japanned, heavy black varnish, and their large grey eyes with a thick dark fringe of lash seemed out of place among the hard features of their companions. It was only by looking at the short petticoats you could assure yourself that they belonged to the same class. In all the houses that I entered were traces of household care and neatness that I had little expected to have seen. The cupboard fastened in the corner of the room and stocked with mugs and cups, the mantelpiece with its images, and the walls covered with showy coloured prints of saints and martyrs, gave an air of comfort that strangely disagreed with the reports of the cabins in Old Ireland. As the doors to the houses were nearly all of them kept open, I could, even whilst walking along, gain some notion of the furniture of the homes. In one house that I visited there was a family of 5 persons, living on the ground floor and occupying 2 rooms. The boards were strewn with red sand, and the front apartment had 3 beds in it, with the printed curtains drawn closely round. In a dark room, at the back, lived the family itself. It was fitted up as a parlour, and crowded to excess with chairs and tables, the very staircase having pictures fastened against the wooden partition. The fire, although it was midday, and a warm autumn morning, served as much for light as for heat, and round it crouched the mother, children, and visitors, bending over the flame as if in the severest winter time. In a room above this were a man and woman lately arrived in England. The woman sat huddled up in a corner smoking, with the husband standing over her, in what appeared at first a menacing attitude. I was informed, however, that they were only planning for the future. This room was perfectly empty of furniture, and the once whitewashed walls were black, excepting the little square patches which showed where the pictures of the former tenants had hung. In another room I found a home so small and full of furniture that it was almost a curiosity for domestic management. The bed, with its chintz curtains looped up, filled one end of the apartment, but the mattress of it served as a long bench for the visitors to sit on. The table was so large that it divided the room in 2, and if there was one picture there must have been 30, all of holy men, with yellow glories round their heads. The window ledge was dressed out with crockery, and in a tumbler were placed the beads. The old dame herself was as curious as her room. Her shawl was fastened over her large frilled cap. She had a little button of a nose, with the nostrils entering her face like bullet holes. She wore over her gown an old pilot coat, well stained with fish slime, and her petticoats being short, she had very much the appearance of a Dutch fisherman or stage smuggler. Her story was affecting, made more so, perhaps, by the emotional manner in which she related it. 9 years ago, the father of the district, the Blessed Lady guard him, had found her late at night, rolling in the gutter, and the boys pelting her with orange peel and mud. She was drunk. The Lord passed by her, and when she came to, she found herself in the chapel, lying before the sanctuary, under the shadow of the Holy Cross. Watching over her was the good father, trying to bring her back to consciousness. He spoke to her of her wickedness, and before she left she took the pledge of temperance. From that time she prospered, and the 1 shilling 6pence the father gave her had God's blessing in it, for she became the best-dressed woman in the court, and in less than 3 years had £15 in the savings bank. The father, heaven cherish him, keeping her book for her, as he did for other poor people. She also joined the Association of the Blessed Lady, and bought herself the dress of the order, a beautiful green velvet which she had now, and which the same cost her 30 shillings. And then she was secure against want in old age and sickness. But after 9 years' prudence and comfort, a brother of hers returned home from the army with a pension of 1 shilling a day. He was wild and persuaded her to break her pledge, and in a short time he got all her savings from her and spent every penny. She couldn't shake him off, for he was the only kin she had on earth, and she must love her own flesh and bones. Then began her misery. It pleased God to visit her old limbs with aches and troubles, and her hips swole with the cold, so that she was at last forced into a hospital, and all that was left of her store was eaten up by sufferance. This, she assured me, all came about by the good father's leaving that parish for another one, but now he had returned to them again, and, with his help and God's blessing, she would yet prosper once more. Whilst I was in the room, the father entered, and old Nora, half divided between joy at seeing him and shame at being again a beggar, laughed and wept at the same time. She stood wiping her eyes with the shawl and groaning out blessings on his reverence, begging of him not to scold her, for she was a weak woman. The renegade brother was had in to receive a lecture from his reverence. A more sottish, idiotic face it would be difficult to imagine. He stood with his hands hanging down like the paws of a dog begging, and his two small eyes stared in the face of the priest as he censured him, without the least expression even of consciousness. Old Nora stood by, groaning like a bagpipe, and writhing while the father spoke to her own brother, as though every reproach was meant for her. The one thing that struck me during my visit to this neighbourhood was the apparent listlessness and lazy appearance of the people. The boys at play were the only beings who seemed to have any life in their actions. The women in their plaid shawls strolled along the pavements, stopping each friend for a chat, or joining some circle, and leaning against the wall as though utterly deficient in energy. The men smoked, with their hands in their pockets, listening to the old crones talking, and only now and then grunting out a reply when a question was directly put to them. And yet it is curious that these people, who seem so inactive, will perform the severest bodily labour, undertaking tasks that the English are almost unfitted for.